I'm sure Kevin will be jumping on in just a moment. It has been 5 minutes. So I'll call the meeting back to order. The next item, 4.12, is our budget workshop. Do you want to start with this, Jana, or Liz, or who? Okay, go ahead, Jana.
All right. So the intent here is for us to talk about short term, what we're going to do with this budget for next year. But also we have some discussion items about rolling into the future. And what I'll do is give you the background of what's happening in the state regarding non-classroom based schools, the additional funding that we're getting. We're going to get into a little bit more detail than Liz's presentation. And the reason why we're going to get into that and also look at some of our data is to allow you all as the board to give Liz and me feedback on the priorities that we should be focused on in our budget, because we will be bringing you a draft budget. We want to make sure it reflects the priorities. We also have met with the budget subcommittee on several of these items, and once we get your feedback as a full board, we will put them into the budget and go over a draft budget in detail with our budget subcommittee as well.
Which I appreciate, Ms. Martell and Mr. Holmes, that you guys have met. And I think at the conclusion of Ms. Gaskell's presentation, I would welcome comments from both of you to start us out. Sure. So you can be thinking about those. That would be really helpful. Go ahead, Jana.
Yeah. So that's,
thank you.
That's the whole point in bringing up the state of the state, as well as essentially, where our priorities may be needing to focus. So non-classroom based schools, we do have a big target on our backs right now, and it is coming through. You already saw it. We got eliminated from some of the funding. There is lots and lots and lots of talk publicly, not just behind closed doors anymore, from legislators. And we saw a couple of videos of some of the things that they have said out loud down in Sacramento during some of their discussions about non-classroom based charter schools. One of the comments from one of the assemblymen was essentially charter school leaders are just in non-classroom based charter school directors are in this to make a profit for themselves. And as you know, a lot of that's coming off the back of the A3 debacle. Mm-hmm. Both gentlemen pleaded guilty a week and a half ago to most of the charges on the A3 issue of basically embezzlement and misuse of public funds. There are several pieces of legislation that are rolling off the backs of the A3 debacle. One of them is AB 1316. It has been authored because, as you know, 2 weeks ago, all legislation had to be authored and numbered and put in. But as you also know, they can be revised and re-revised and re-revised through the committee process. And AB 1316 right now is not that ugly, but it is the bill that was reserved to nail non-classroom based charter schools. One of the things that has been floating around, I've talked to several of you about this, including the budget subcommittee when we first heard about this, is the potential of the state saying either this coming school year or more than likely the year after, because we're dealing so much with COVID and we have a governor that's being recalled. It will, the goal or the intent of many of the legislators in Sacramento is to just say all non-classroom based schools will get 30% less funding. Period. End of story. No more funding determination processes. Just you're done. We're taking 30% of your funding away. So we will cross the bridge when we get to it, but it is on the horizon, and they're still talking about it even possibly for next year. I think as we get closer and closer to every charter and every district having to get their budget submitted to the state, it gets further away for happening to us for next year, but it's not going to go away. AB 1505. This is what Jim was referring to earlier. This is our. Is that the fire guy? Everybody else should be here. Oh, he's still here. Okay.
He's still.
Okay. Sorry. We had a little fire alarm problem, Liz. You'll see the bill. In North Bay yesterday.
There's also people in the suite.
Oh, okay. Okay. I just heard noise. I was worried. All right. AB 1505 was authorized. It was, if you remember, the year that we hired a lobbyist to help us with AB 1505 and AB 1507. And AB 1505 essentially established new criteria for renewals of charter schools. And it's a very complicated bill, and I'm trying to summarize it, the things that you need to know about it. It places charter schools into 3 categories: high performing, middle performing, and low performing, based on our dashboards. And you've seen the dashboards before. It's all of our criteria. The high performing schools, basically, they just automatically get renewed. And they have to essentially show 2 measurements of academic performance per year, and I'm reading the red here, in each of the 2 consecutive years immediately preceding the renewal decision, or there's just know that there's or. And the reason why I wanted this here, even though we're not high performing, is I wanted the board to understand high performing doesn't necessarily mean, and this is very important for our staff to understand, it does not mean that we have students that are performing better than the rest of the state in the sense of like they're the smartest, brightest, and they test the best. What it does mean is that we are showing continued growth in all of the areas on the dashboard. I'm oversimplifying complicated legislations and dashboard pieces that I turn to Lindsay for when I don't understand, but it is about growth. And that's why, even though we have students that are very, very far behind in their basic skills when they come to us, it is why we are in the middle performing, which is the next slide. The middle performing status. And they literally, the Department of Education takes their big data crunching machine and throws all the charter schools into it, and it rolls it out, and they tell us if you're high, middle, or low. And so we are in the middle performing because we are able to show growth. And we're able to show growth on our dashboard because of things that we have implemented, like RTI and our MTSS process, and the way that our teachers work with the kids and try to get them to, essentially grow. So what do we have to prove to be renewed with San Marcos next year? The problem with being in the middle category is, as Jim said earlier, it gives a lot of discretion to the local district. And essentially, they have to look at our subgroups, which are EL and special education and foster and homeless and juvenile hall kids. And actually, they're not a subgroup, our English language learners and our socially, economically disadvantaged students. Those are our subgroups. And to make sure that we are improving and helping them to improve and showing so on our dashboard. It also means that our post-secondary, our preparation for college and career, that is one of the pieces of the dashboard. And all of those things are going into the green. Our suspensions and expulsion percentages going down, that would put us into the green, and all of those factors roll into this. Now, the problem with the test scores themselves for growth is that the authorizer is told to sit down with your charter school and you define what that growth means. Well, how do you measure it? How do you look at it? What tools are you using to look at it? But this legislation went further and said, oh, by the way, the State Board of Education is going to get lobbied by these big companies. That wasn't in the legislation. That's just my opining there. They're going to get lobbied by some of these testing companies, and they're going to come up with a list of verified data companies. And you can only use those companies. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So that is the middle performing charter schools. We have to have measurable increases, essentially, with the emphasis on our subgroups. I'm going to say it over and over again because this is going to drive our budget decisions, I think. Go ahead, Liz. I kind of already said that slide. Here's the verified data slide. The companies that were approved, there's a long list of them. Unfortunately, we really don't have a curriculum person at this time that hasn't landed on anybody's job description permanently to date. But Liz has been looking at some of these companies. Lindsay's been looking at some of these companies. I've been looking at some of them. But the bottom line is Exact Path was not on it. iReady was. As you remember, our Exact Path and iReady are benchmark assessments that we administer at least 3 times a year, so that we can show our authorizers that our students are actually learning. other than just the state testing, which we didn't even have last year. So if you were a charter school renewing this year, you were in all kinds of messes because you had no testing data. And this is why we've implemented ExactPath. But the thing we liked about ExactPath and iReady is it tests the kid. It says, here's where the gaps are. Now, kiddo, here's instruction we want you to engage in to fill those gaps. And it actually gives them instruction. It does the remediation, more or less. And the high schoolers did not like the iReady because it was very caricature and immature, and the kids hated it. So we got ExactPath. So we need to take a look at the companies, and we need to find something, an alternative. But I hate the fact that they're basically saying, we're going to tell you exactly what curriculum you have to use, essentially, what testing systems you have to use. And they don't work for our kids, and they don't work for our program. So it is a conundrum. So keep going, Liz.
Well, let's take I think it's a good breaking point. So board members, let's take a look. I see Kevin has his hand up. Let's go ahead, Kevin. I think it's good for us to talk about these criteria at this point and this data before we jump to the next topic. Kevin, I think your hand was up. Go ahead.
Well, what I just wanted to say is that the curriculum committee, which existed of Lindsay and Rachel, Lindsay helped me here. It was Lindsay, Tom, and I, and Megan. And so the four of us actually looked at curriculum that both was, that provided both summative and formative assessments is the terms that we use in education. Short-term assessments, and which are formative, they inform the instruction of the teachers, and then summative, which is the data piece that's needed for these plans. And so part of my advocacy would be, is the curriculum committee going to reconvene in order to address the concerns that Jana has presented?
I would love it to. Yeah. The biggest challenge there, Kevin, is since responsibilities have grown in data and accountability, and I might just say, yeah, I'd like the committee to reconvene. Yes, thank you, Kevin.
And I would like that too. If you are open to that, that'd be great, Kevin, because I think we need to make sure though that you can staff it appropriately. That's my
that's kind of where I was
is because we don't have a curriculum staff person. We may talk about that later.
So Jana and Tom and I can discuss perhaps who are the appropriate site-based personnel that would support that decision making.
That'd be great.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's do it. Perfect. Okay, I feel great about that. Thank you, Kevin, for stepping up, and Tom, appreciate it. I saw Tom jump out of his chair at that.
I mean, Tom is so excited about participating in this.
He looks thrilled. So ordered. I got to use the gavel today. All right. Always a cool thing. Okay. Any questions on this performing? This is really important that all the board members understand this. I'll assume we do. If I'll move on the middle performing, how we're in this kind of gray area I spoke of earlier. So to get renewed. So it's important that we're all on that same page. So I'll assume we are. We understand our challenge for the curriculum committee on the path assessment that creates the data. So I appreciate them stepping up. Okay, we'll continue then. Jana, go ahead.
Okay, great, thank you. So the effects of AB 1505 and our renewal criteria, we need to talk about the verifiable data. I love that we'll have some support from the board committee and the possible new assessment system. We have to focus on academic growth, especially of our subgroups, EL, special education, low income students. Focus on, because of, again, the dashboard and how they measure whether or not we are growing as a school and improving. Focusing on post-secondary, such as CTE and college prep. And as you all know at this point, we don't have a lot of students that are in the UPrep Academy working on A through G, the UC bound kind of students. So that's why we're really rolling out CTE. And we really need to ensure that we have a strong curriculum and program implementation to be able to implement growth and remediating these kids when they come in with big gaps in their skills. The RTI just kind of scratched at the surface this year, and it's made significant headway with some of our kids, and we want to do more of that. So we have, for example, one of Tracy's staff person, Brooke Van Ardsdale, who's in charge of RTI. She's been meeting with Craig and our MTSS coordinator, Kristen, and they've been identifying gaps in our remediation and how we can do growth. So we have people working on it already. So this is the net effect of our renewal, and all of our schools will be up for renewal in the next 3 years, with San Marcos, Pivot San Diego starting next year. The other thing that will affect your helping us prioritize the budget is the effects of AB 86. They are essentially giving a lot of money to focus on face-to-face instruction. That's what this money is supposed to be spent on, with an additional $1,000 per homeless pupil. At least 85% of the funds need to be spent on direct in-person instruction.
And Liz, did you say this is $500,000?
Yes, 500.
Yes, it's 541,000 approximately.
Wow. Okay.
So again,
And it has to be, and it basically has to be spent in a year and a half, 1 year. So it's a fairly short time frame.
Whew.
Yeah.
Okay.
So again, this will drive what you suggest we need to prioritize in the budget. 15% of it can be spent on supporting distance learning, because if you remember, they were also incentivizing monies for the distance learning for all the school districts when COVID first
Only
hit.
10% for real.
Right. So 10% must be used. Yes, Tom.
Is this a one-time allocation or is it potentially going on?
No, it's one time.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's a big deal.
Yeah, it is.
Yep.
And Tom, will you speak more to that just for the record? I mean, I agree wholeheartedly, but you and Kevin both have that experience.
Well, Kevin knows we've been through stuff like this, and we got some money for ESL kids, and we ended up buying a lot. I hate to say it, we bought a lot of equipment and materials that we could use over time, or somehow we're able to get things that could last a while, because you've only got 1.5 years to use this. You've got to think wisely. You don't want to incur too much in staffing, because then you can't keep doing it. And then you can, so it's a nice thing to have. The problem is that then it stops.
Or you're doing contract services or one-time stipends for catch-up learning or something. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be very, very careful.
Yes.
What they want you to do is they want you to expand it, then you continue paying for it, and that's usually behind some of this stuff. So, but if that's not going to happen, you got to be really careful.
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing here is very typical of our challenges as educational leaders, is that you have legislators who respond to political or social needs in a one-time circumstance that then educators have to try to make sense of.
Yep.
Very well said.
That's the most sense I've heard of it.
I know.
And, I think, Pat and Jim, you probably have perspective insight, but, one of the things I learned early in my career was that education was one of the few things that could be legislated on a 12-month cycle by state and federal leaders, other than other forms of government, whether it's, civil law or, in taxes or God knows what. But education is something that can be easily legislated on an annual basis. And so therefore, as educators, we had to always be prepared for these annual legislative political responses. And as Tom said, the response to EL learners was historically one of them. This is another. And so I think we have to just be very thoughtful as to how my intentional question would be, how can we best use these funds to serve Pivot charter schools today and tomorrow? And I would leave that with Jana and Liz and with the site leaders, but how can we best use these funds to impact the outcomes that we would like to accomplish as a board and as Pivot Charter today and tomorrow.
Well, that will be the question that I'm not letting us off the hook for, because we are going to answer that today, sir. And so I'm glad you framed it so well, because we will leave today with some answer to that question.
Yep.
May I
Yes.
just jump in here? So this is very reminiscent of my former life in fundraising, where a lot of foundations would make grants of 3 to 5 years for a project, and then the institution is sort of either on the hook to decide to cancel the program or fund it. And this is where I think this gets into more strategic planning and what we want to do with fundraising. But this is where, if we had a fundraising apparatus, we might be able to perpetuate these sorts of programs that this kind of money will help to fund. I think, but 1 year is really tough, because you just don't have time to develop meaningful programs in 1 year. So I'm not sure exactly where I'm going with this, but I just wanted to add that.
Well, I think one of the places you're going that I think we're going to talk about, and then I'll recognize Board Member Martell, is, Steve, to some of the, you've challenged us to think about other revenue sources and other operating income for Rhodes Education Organization. And I think that is becoming a more fertile discussion that I will also want us to have as part of these budget talks today, when you see the final questions that Jana has for us. And I think as we look to, we need to use this money for one-time things quickly, which is a challenge, but are the ways I'm going to ask all of you that we can use those that leverage or set up other opportunities. And that's where I think we can be really strategic. So I appreciate what you're saying. I hear you, what you're saying. Pat, go ahead.
So I'm going to concur with what you just said, Jim. And I think the overarching emphasis needs to be on one time. So while I appreciate exactly what Steve was saying, I think, you know, because it is one-time funding, that expending a lot of time about strategic initiatives that are going to go beyond a year, I don't think are going to be real productive for us. I mean, I think we need to focus on, we can get X amount of dollars, we have a year to use it. How do we best accommodate the use of that funding, you know, and not spend a lot of time planning for something that after a year, we all know the likelihood of us being able to sustain it is not going to exist.
Right. Other good point. Other comments? Good discussion so far.
I guess if I could just jump in about the one aspect that I think Dr. Halverson mentioned, and several of the board members, you know, pointed out, we don't want to incur additional expenses like in our structural, you know, foundational budget, like with staffing and things like that. But this bill specifically says we must spend at least 10% to hire paraprofessionals. It doesn't necessarily say as employees, so we might be able to hire some paraprofessionals as contractors on a short-term basis, but these are the kinds of things that we'll need to put into our expenditure plan, which you all have to approve by June 1st. I'm not sure if Jana had mentioned this, and it's a very short turnaround, but we will most likely have to hold a special board meeting to approve this.
So as a professional like Dr. Harrigan and a paraprofessional like Dr. Halverson, what's the difference?
A paraprofessional is like an aide, for lack of better terms.
Forgive me, Dr. Halverson, I misunderstood.
Yes, it's like an aide.
It's like a city manager.
True that. True that. Pat, is your hand still up? Is your hand still up, Pat?
Being more serious, I want to caution you that raising money, the local high school here where we are, and it's a high income area, it's about 1,500 kids. They raise about $500,000 a year. Now, this is a high school, it's been here forever. It's in a high income area. Parents are really involved, and they can do something like that with a 1,500 kid ADA. To raise anything close to that is very, very difficult on an ongoing basis. And but I'm pointing out the issue. I think Steve's right about raising money, but trying to compare it to $500,000, the odds of it happening in the level we would need is going to be really difficult. So I think what Pat
Yes.
talked about is we have to have it in mind. What can we do with the best of these funds for a year and hopefully make a difference that can carry on in some way, but don't incur a lot of costs to them. And that's the way it is. So
Well put. Thank you for making that clear.
Yeah. And as Liz mentioned, going down the bullets here, we actually have to have a separate spending plan that we will put together and bring to you. We will have to have a special board meeting because we don't have a June board meeting scheduled. And this has to be approved by, or we do, but this has to be approved before we have that meeting. It has to be approved by June 1st. So, and Liz and I are not going to have this together for the April meeting. So that's why we're going to have a special board meeting just to approve this. OJ?
And
Yes, is there a correlation between the funds and the number of students?
Yes, it is allocated on a per pupil. It's actually allocated based on our LCFF, right, Liz? Yeah.
And
Yeah,
is there
more or less, yes.
is there a target number to match that funding?
There's no match required for this one, but we do have our total pivot wide numbers. It's 541,000 pivot wide. So that's, split up over the various sites, but I believe it's about 83 to 86,000 at the smaller schools, and then the remainder at Pivot North Bay.
Okay, let's keep going because we will have some targeted questions for us. Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, I was just going to say the 10% for paraprofessionals, is that, can we enhance? Well, first of all, do we have paraprofessionals as a group in our employ? And can it be used to enhance the current positions?
Yes.
And also 10% of 500,000 is really not that much money. So when we look at, for example, it's as simple as increasing the number of hours for our current paraprofessionals to meet that criteria with the dollar amount threshold we need to meet. So it can be as simple as that in terms of implementation.
Yes, and yes, absolutely. Thank you. So we're really talking about today, I have specific questions that I want your feedback on in a little bit for next year's budget. And from that discussion, you will also be giving us seeds of knowledge to how to develop this expenditure plan. But since it is only one-time monies, as we keep emphasizing, really our bigger discussion is about our budget, our future budget, not this AB 86 budget. But yes, as we talk about our budget, we will also be able to ascertain from you all where you want our priorities to be for this budget, the 86 budget as well, AB 86. So OJ, you had a question.
Well, the question I had is if it seems like for each school that wouldn't affect a huge number of students. If you broke that $500,000 down between the 5 schools, is it a conflict of interest to develop a program where existing staff can make more money during that year?
You're reading our minds, OJ. You're reading our minds. We are allowed to do stipend work on a special assignment, which again would be one-time situational types of support. That's exactly where most of the districts will be spending their money, on extending the day, for example, and paying the teacher extra to stay longer to do. Again, remember, this is about face-to-face, in-person instruction. So part of our challenge is also getting the kids to come to be face-to-face. Remember, we only have about 40%, 50% of our kids that even come to a resource center. So we have to, figure out how to attract them to come to the resource center to get this additional face-to-face stipends.
So for OJ, I think you're on to something good. One of the things I'm going to be asking you guys is on the next slide, you're going to see allowable use of funds. Can we go to the next slide, Liz? Because I want us to be thinking clearly. Some of our students need to be caught up, and that's the point of this. We need to be very selective and smart about how we engage our staff with one-time bumps to try and get more time in front of some of these kids that are data-driven, as we've talked about, that help raise some of our metrics for our read charter. But I also think if and when we decide to get in other lines of, we have these resource centers that are utilized for just a portion of the day, whether we're going to get involved in tutoring or health services or other things, these dollars could be used to test it and to see how it works on a one-time basis, and to potentially train and utilize our team in a way that gets them to see if they're interested and are we able to do other things. I'm really interested in that. And that's something I'll be challenging us on later. But I think, I have a hard time saying anything good sometimes about the state. But this is one where I think we actually have some really strategic opportunity once and focused quickly that could be really great. When you look at this list here, learning gaps, small groups, health, counseling, mental health, community learning hubs. A lot of these things are areas where we could continue in the future, perhaps, if we find ourselves effective when we get a free shot at it. So
Well said.
yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm not going to go through this entire list. You can read it, and again, it'll come out in our discussion as to what your priorities are for our overall budget for next year, and these are the things that we'll be bringing suggestions back to you on for the actual expenditure plan of AB 86. So, all right. And again, just focusing on.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask
Yes.
a simple question? And this might be pedantic, but does not the single school plan for student achievement and the LCAP already respond to these questions? I mean, what I'm saying is, if we've recently reauthorized a student plan for student achievement at each site, and we've reauthorized an LCAP, are those not our guiding rudders for how then we can use funding to respond to database decision making and the goals that are embedded in those plans?
Yes, I think they're starting points for sure, but this is much more broad. But yes.
But I mean, what I'm just saying is historically, when we would get a new initiative, we would as a district use our existing plans to inform our decision making as we moved forward.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's just my advocacy.
Yes, and it's a very valid point. Thank you. So again, on the AB 86 monies, the one-time monies, these are the prioritized pupils we must focus on. And in our SIPSA, we were focusing on only socioeconomically disadvantaged kids. So one little line of this, and that's what I meant by this is much more broad. So, okay.
But our LCAP asks us to address all these populations.
Correct. Yes. Yes. As Liz mentioned, the 3 rounds of ESSR funds, we did not get the first round. We will get the second and the third round. These are the things that we can expend them on. And again, we are looking at all of this and our LCAP goals and bringing it together to come up with some programmatic changes for you factored into our budget moving forward. After school, summer school, that kind of thing. Go ahead, Liz. All right, so now shifting gears away from those one-time AB 86 monies, but yet it is very related. Obviously, there's lots of overlap, exactly like Kevin just said. But the priorities based on everything that we've just told you, our priorities, the things that we've outlined, and we wanted your feedback on it, see if there's anything you didn't think is a priority or that you wanted to add to this. But we need to talk about the verified data options and the contracts that we will have to look at. And I really appreciate that we can reconvene a curriculum committee to help with that. CTE, again, moving forward, because that is on our dashboard and that's where our students need the most help because they're not UC bound for the most part. English language learner programs, we must focus on that. We must be able to show that our students are improving. And frankly, we also need to focus on how to outreach to those students better, to be honest. We try, I was able to show Chico Unified, for example, all of our Spanish ads. Thanks to Pepe Smith, they sent them to me. So we try, but we need to spend some time focus on building that population as well. As you know, in our charters, it says that we will do everything we can to meet the district's numbers. And we're not coming close on EL, but we're actually doing better attracting some of the other special populations than the districts are. We need to focus on strengthening our curriculum to ensure the academic growth. The administration, you know, my cabinet, so to speak, which is, you know, Lindsay, Tracy, all the site admin, you know, we've been looking at where our gaps are. You know, Corrine, everybody has been coming to the table. We really need to make some improvements to our program to continue to be able to show that the kids are improving. In-person instruction and tutoring and closing the gaps. Those are kind of what we had assembled as our priorities, and we just wanted board input on that.
Did you want to show the data before we get into this?
The data is more about enrollment.
Okay, then I think I'd like to hear from Board Member Martell and Holmes, since you guys are a budget committee, and your initial thoughts on what you've seen and kind of how your meeting went. Pat, can I start with you, please?
Well, you know, I have to say that, first of all, that it sounded, when we met, the conversation sounded like last year and prior years.
We focus primarily on compensation.
I don't mean to make light of it, but, you know, I think it's the same conversation that we have each year. And how do we provide the best program within the budget limitations that we have? And then also to really focus on sustainability. And, you know, Jim, you and I know that given the way that the state operates and what we've already heard this morning, you know, it doesn't give us a real strong sense of being able to create sustainability going forward. On a yearly basis, there are great opportunities that are presented, but over the long term, what we're looking at is, you know, we can see very marginal growth each year, and that doesn't allow for strategically thinking big and thinking in terms of how do we do more than what we are doing now. So I think that's kind of the frustrating part each year when we do this, is recognizing that our staff does an amazing job with the resources they have available, and we'd love to do more, but how can we do that? So I think that, you know, we tried to look at the budget in terms of the status quo, and to the extent that we have additional resources available to look at where the greatest needs are and try and apply available resources or additional resources like we've talked about this morning to those areas without creating longer term financial impacts that we can't sustain. And you know, it's not the kind of message or story that, you know, really inspires kind of work that we should be doing and expanding the opportunities for our young people at Pivot. But I think we're focusing on the quality of the program and what we can do right now, but with the understanding that we got to sustain it. There's just not any way for us to not face the hardcore reality that we're not going to be able to expand a lot of our existing programs. But we can think strategically and identify, as we were doing just a few minutes ago, looking at the list of possibilities for the additional funding that's available, to look at where we're going to have the biggest impact, at least on a short-term basis.
Thank you.
I would add to that. I mean, this year, well, Pat, you're right. It's, you know, it's sort of the same conversation we have had with the uncertainties that we have out there. They're more pronounced. ADA being a big conversation. We sit down, we talk about the budget, and we have to make assumptions that are really, you know, less based on our current situation than they've ever been, right? And so at a certain point, we just have to say, okay, we've got to make some assumptions, and we've got to know that there's going to be changes, but we've got to do that. And so we sat down, we spoke specifically, we talked about compensation, and we made some decisions about, you know, kind of a policy for that, which gives us flexibility, but also makes a commitment to staff that we're going to continue to, you know, to compensate them and have some growth in the compensation. And you know, while we've got all these things going on with all this uncertainty, we can't let that keep us from doing anything. And so we've got to just keep going, and we've got to, you know, have some flexibility, but we also have to assume that we're going to be a going concern, and this is how it's going to go forward.
I think that balance is really important that you mentioned, Ralph, because, you know, I think we've been doing a good job over the last couple of years of trying to create that balance of recognizing that we want to be able not just to sustain the programs, but we want to sustain high quality staff. And by creating opportunities for them to see what the future might be offering them has been very important. I think the board has done the best that we have been able to under uncertain circumstances to create some sort of, you know, predictability about what staff can expect. And it's that balance, I think, going forward in this environment of uncertainty that we really have to focus on. And I think that the budget should clearly reflect that. And I think the message to our staff needs to be that we're behind them, we support them, but these are still very challenging times for us.
So thank you. I appreciate those opening comments from both of you. I think the priorities in front of us is, I take it this is identified by the administration.
Yeah.
I mean, these make sense to me, and it makes sense that we have some one-time dollars to try and tighten some of these things up. So I would concur that these are the priorities, and likely in that order, because that's what we need to address being in the mid-tier for our charter review. So seems pretty straightforward to me.
Yeah, and other than the verified data options and contracts, all of this is reflected in our original LCAP.
Right.
Not so much the SIPSA because it's a one-year thing, but the LCAP.
But this is what we've been saying we needed to do in our LCAP.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
Okay. So let's keep this in mind, this slide, because we're going to look at some enrollment trends and why we're going to be assuming certain enrollment levels. And then we'll come back to these key questions. But this is looks like this. So this is Jana and her team's thoughts on what our priorities should be. We'll now look at enrollment and some other trends, and then come back to the board on, okay, so what are our priorities going to be? And what opportunities do we have one time and longer term strategic thinking? And that's where I want to push us. So why don't we go ahead into the enrollment trends?
Yeah, so one of the questions I'll be asking you, and we have a suggestion, but it's, we want to show you the enrollment history. But as Ralph mentioned very clearly, honestly, you guys, I have absolutely no idea what our enrollment is, how our enrollment is going to be affected by COVID. It could be that all of the families are going to be saying, you know what, this has worked really, really great. I'm still going to be scared in September to send my kids back to a comprehensive high school with, 1,500 kids. Or they could say, I am so gosh darn done with online anything. We're out of here, right? We have no idea. And it's probably going to be a mixed bag, a little bit of both. But again, just for historical sake, so you know where we were, I asked Lindsay to put together our slides to show you what enrollment has been. Really, basically what you're seeing is it is leveled off, right? And we talked about this last spring, that we are now who we are. This is who we are. I don't expect us to be significantly just, in normal times. Before COVID, we said we're kind of where we're at. Yes, we'd like the smaller schools to be at about 150, 160 kids. Yep. And North Bay is capped at, 480 is what you originally said, but we haven't been able to hire for that. So that was original. But it looks like, we are who we are, right? I mean, under normal circumstances. Special education enrollment, went up, lots of spikes. It too has actually leveled off. It went down a little bit this year. Tracy and I have spoken to this at length. We think that it'll probably go back up to former levels after COVID. And the reason is because all of the school districts were also, could you mute, please? The school districts were offering online programs as well. And so I think a lot of the families stayed with their local school districts because they were also trying to offer online, right?
Mhm.
So Tracy and I think that the numbers are going to go back up to where they used to be. There's nothing, they were that way for many, many years. So anyway, on to the next one. Average enrollments. Again, I asked Lindsay to put together some general data so that that the average enrollment throughout the school year and average special education enrollment, because it goes up and down throughout the school year and it increases towards the end of the school year is our trends, but this is the average over the years. So it has gone up. It's gone down in North Valley, Riverside's up and down. I think with the new site it's going to go up, but I have nothing to base that statement on. And the biggest year that we in San Diego was the year that we took on those Talion kids, but that was an anomaly. So those are just some data there. Re-enrollment. This was not in the presentation that was originally posted because we started our re-enrollment campaign 6 weeks sooner than we normally would. And we have sent out all of the re-enrollment information to our families to re-enroll because I wanted all of us, especially Liz and I, to have some kind of idea on what we expect as far as re-enrollment, just for us, this is something that the budget subcommittee said is, Jana, how can we give you ideas on what to assume the enrollment on if we have no data, right? So that's why I'm like, you're right, we got to start re-enrollment right now. And so we started it like 2 days after the budget subcommittee met with us. So Lindsay just tallied these. I wanted these to be up to date. She sent these to me about 7:30 this morning. So we are looking fairly good, except for North Valley. It's trending, almost the way it was in prior years. Almost, but again, remember, we're doing it 6 weeks early. So maybe some families, don't want to commit that early. That could be it. So it could work for us or against us that we started early, but at least it's not, except for North Valley, at least it's not horrifically different than what it's been in prior years, right? So that's good to know. I am worried about North Valley. Did I mention that?
Hey, so I had a question, and it's not quite on point, but maybe it is. As I look at us reopening, and I'm looking at what the other other public schools have done.
Yeah.
And how do we distinguish ourselves from them as they've because they've had to do what we do,
Right.
and so as part of the conversation about how we're targeting students, how we're serving students, how we're attracting students, how we're competing, if that's maybe not the right word, but I asked myself that question.
Yeah, and it's a great question. We ask it too every week at 2:00 with Trip Peppy Smith for the last couple of months.
Okay.
And the answer is to some degree, and the admin can chime in. We are doing it better than they are in most circumstances. And I think parents realize that. They were very frustrated. I mean, you heard Mr. Lewis about his kids program even, right? And they were very frustrated with the way the traditional schools did it.
Yeah.
And so we are distinguishing ourselves by saying, we've perfected this the last 11 years. We know how to do this. We're the best of all worlds. And so that's sort of how we're distinguishing ourselves. The other factor is, unless things dramatically change and get worse in the COVID world, most school districts will be eliminating their hybrid programs.
Yeah.
Not completely. There are some school districts that are like, yeah, we can do this. We're just going to make it better. We're going to do it. We're going to try to steal all those non-classroom based charter schools back. But most of them just don't have the calories to put towards it.
Yeah.
They can't become like Dr. Halverson has frequently reminded us. They can't be all things to all kids. God bless you.
They go the mean.
So they're focused on their comprehensive high school, right, and making that better. So most of them are going to give up these hybrid programs. And I do think that families will want to continue in some form of hybrid or online in the fall, and the districts just can't continue to be split that way, you know?
Yeah.
So that's,
If I were a school district, I'd be very nervous about eliminating those programs because some people may have wanted to maintain them.
yeah.
And what that's going to do to their attendance. But
Yeah.
I just, anyway, I kind of go off task a little bit.
No,
so,
no, it's absolutely related, Ralph. Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add a note as well with that, with respect to charter schools? So we just had the annual California Charter Schools Association conference this last week, and one of the sessions that I attended was actually encouraging classroom-based charter schools to keep their independent study programs because they can enroll more students that way. So we may see more competition, maybe not from the school districts keeping their independent study and hybrid programs, but from the other classroom-based charter schools maintaining their independent study programs because they see it as, you know, a potential additional source of revenue moving forward.
And dovetailing off of that, the districts know that we're doing that. And that is why some of the legislation, and it doesn't even have to all be legislatively done. It could just be an executive order, or the Department of Education can do it regulatory, where they just say, we're capping your enrollment again, charter schools. Now, they have not done that. There is no legislation floated for that, but it is not a concept that has gone away because of everything that you're saying. And they know that we do this better. You know, there's 480,000, I could be off on that number, but there was several 100,000 students in non-classroom based charter schools. So they want them back, you know, they want their students back. And so some of the districts will keep their programs, but you know, they're just struggling to do all things for all people, just like, you know, we are. So yeah, so it's very valid. Move on, Liz, to the Lindsay's data here on slide 18. Again, this
There's one in here too.
sorry, back to, I'm sorry, Liz, the slide before that. Yeah, so the first week of the campaign, first day of the campaign, 2 weeks later, between, you know, May 1, like, so we're way earlier. And we're doing pretty well here. We didn't have staffing last year when we were doing our re-enrollment campaign, so we didn't have accurate numbers. That's why last year's number is void there for 2020 because we had lost staff. So nobody was really tracking it at that early stage. So I feel pretty good about these numbers, the re-enrollment numbers, even though we started early. So again, I just wanted you all to have, we will frequently give you this data on why people enroll in Pivot Charter School. And the biggest response is our flexible school schedule, right? We were just talking about that. Opportunity for virtual schooling and need more academic and support. And so this is what differentiates us, Ralph. This is sort of the answer to your question, right? This is why they're coming. Remember the year that bullying was like the top one? Well, it's changed. It's more about our program, right? And it's really interesting to see this because this is the COVID response. This is the COVID year, right? So we used to say people weren't necessarily running to our program. They were running away from something else at the former school. Well, the data actually shows us they are running to our program, at least in the COVID year. So I thought this was an interesting little bit of a shift. So go ahead, Liz.
It is interesting. What's that data from? This recently?
We do that's when a kid enrolls, they fill out a survey as to why they're coming.
All right.
So, yep. Withdrawals, it's all over the map, but you can see that site by site, it's, you know, pretty consistent when they withdraw and how many, you know, from one year to the next. So go on to the next slide, Liz, because it's a little bit more helpful to see why and how. As you remember, you know, voluntary versus MTSS, voluntarily withdrawing, you know, we're out of here, we don't like this virtual stuff, versus the student has gone through a really, really rigorous process of multiple tiered system of support, that's MTSS. And eventually, per the education code, we are required to determine whether or not it's in the best interest of the student to remain in independent study. And if it's a special ed student, there's even more elaborate of a process. So these are those numbers on withdrawals. As you notice on the top chart there, we have had, you know, relatively the same amount of withdrawals. For San Diego, Riverside went up. North Valley is is, relatively same, a little bit of an increase from last year's COVID, half COVID year versus this year's COVID year on just the withdrawals on the average. So.
Yeah, but the smaller schools, the percentages, all it takes is one to make it different,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
As opposed to North Bay where you really have.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting though as you start thinking about the withdrawals because, they're not going back to school. They're going to,
They may have been this year, right?
Yeah.
Because the traditional schools were offering similar things to what we were.
Yeah.
So they may have been this year, but traditionally, you're right. They don't go back to the traditional schools. I mean, historically. Yes. Yep. Okay, on to the next one.
Okay, so here we go. This
Yeah.
is the discussion. So the first thing we need to talk about as we look at our budget is our enrollment assumption. And right now, I think what the budget committee has sent forward is assume same enrollment. No increase, no decrease in light of how unpredictable things are. So that'd be the first question I would ask. Does the board endorse that assumption? Same enrollment as this year.
I agree, Tom.
Others?
I would agree. OJ?
I would agree as well.
Okay, and then Steve, your thoughts? You good? Or do you?
He's on the phone. His computer. Or was
Steve, does that make sense to you? I'm comfortable with that. I think that's the budget committee's recommendation.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so assuming enrollment of this year, not pre-COVID year. Okay. Okay, great. Then the priority expenditures. So if we go back to that slide, and this is something the staff will have to put together, but there was a slide, Liz, that had the administration's priorities right there. Made a lot of sense to me. Kevin and Tom, as educators, I am certainly interested in what you think here.
I would agree with that. I think Pat mentioned before, next year will be very precarious because of enrollment, because of what the finances are. And Jana mentioned at one point in the beginning of all this, it could be a 30% cut someday down the road for, our kind of program. So I think being selective as you've done and making sure those things work, but don't add much of anything because it's not going to happen. So I think conservative. I would agree with that.
Kevin?
Well, I would just, build on what Pat and Tom have said, is that always our primary focus is providing a instructional program for the students in the design model which we've chosen. And that's our baseline from which we work and provide, the sources of income to support. And then federal, state, and local programs or guidelines, which are implemented through our SIPSAs and the LCAP, are our second indicators of how we're to use our expenses. And as long as those are aligned, which they are here, and what's been identified by staff, then we're acting, as Pat and Tom have said, in a respectful, thoughtful, but conservative way. So.
Okay, thank you.
You could curve it.
So I think on the whole, to summarize this portion of the discussion, conservative, based on this year, I think you have some priorities here. We're in concurrence on most of where you're headed. So does that give you what you need before we get into the next section?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
And I also want to compliment staff. Jana and Liz and I talked about this when we talked about compensation. We have the consistency of 5 years worth of data from which to make our decision making.
Yeah.
And we didn't historically have that. And now that we have that information, I think that it's, in many ways, the decisions are relatively clear.
Yeah, I agree, Kevin. There's no shockers here, right?
No.
You know?
Right.
No.
Okay. Well, what is the shocker maybe is the next slide. This is something I've asked to put on the agenda, and that is additional revenue options. So for some time, it's been no secret that, and this is going to be tricky, but I want to challenge the board and talk about it. Can I just do this? So it's pretty clear that the state has an issue with the independent learning model. And that's our model. And it's frustrating because what they're angry at isn't us, but they're not taking the time or getting the perspective, or we aren't doing enough. We independent learning schools, independent study schools, not we Pivot, are not doing enough to get in front of these legislators and help them understand that we're not the bad people, that we're actually helping the students, I think, that have the most need. That said, our revenue is tied to one source, and that is the funding we get from the state for independent learning, independent study. And so if we saw a 30% cut, that's pretty devastating. And I think that our board, with the experience and expertise and the thoughtfulness we have, needs to start thinking about Roads Education Organization. When I started Roads Education Organization, it was about serving kids who were underserved, who fell through the cracks, who were not getting the help, the kids that the public school system and other service providers weren't getting to. And the first focus was education and schooling, and that's been our focus. I want to talk about, and Steve, you've really, and I'll invite you to join me here in a minute, have kind of talked about what other revenue options are there. Roads Education Organization can do a lot of things. Right now, it is simply a charter management organization that owns and manages Pivot charter schools. And that's a big deal. I know that we don't have more staff capacity to do something else. And so that's where this is a challenging discussion, but I want to have it. So we could start another focus of Roads Education. And what could that be? You know, and I think we have to be careful. And Jana is already talking to our attorney and how we utilize resources and what we can and can't use. And you can see some of these restrictions we have. But I want to hear from the board, is there any appetite at all to talk further about this? We won't have answers today, but we can go to the next slide, please. Are there abilities to rent our space for other issues, whether it's childcare or counseling or other boys and girls clubs or other things that may be worthwhile? Are there, and this is back to the one-time dollars, are there after-school programs we can begin piloting once to see whether it's stipending our teachers or utilizing other resources we have to see if we can even deliver this business? And what are some of these programs? I know Ralph has shared a few with me. So what are those, and can we do that? And then finally, next and final, are there fee-based programs that we might be able to do? I don't know that they require a legal entity. If we reinvest the dollars back, we're not profiting. We're going to reinvest them back into the services. So, but the daycare, preschool, tutoring, other things. And so I wanted to challenge the board. We didn't include on here fundraising, philanthropy, foundations, but these things will help us move that direction, I think, being better to fund. So I just wanted to challenge the board and hear initial reactions. Is there even any opportunity? You know, Jane and I, as I reported at the last board meeting, with some parents. We met some parents in Ventura who are feeling very underserved, and we're looking for a classroom-based model, which would be a different type of charter than we've done. That also would diversify us from being just independent study versus classroom-based. It's a whole different way. Now, again, this is going to require our time. This will be challenging to board members because we're going to have to do some of this work because Jana and her administration don't have a lot of time. And we'll talk about that later. But anyway, that's my introduction to this topic. I wanted to challenge the board to have it. Steve, may I implore you to share some of your thoughts on this issue, because you've long challenged me, and those have been fertile comments. I really appreciated your challenge. Can you share some of your thoughts first?
So Chairman Lewis, Steve Siegel was just having some technical difficulties. He's been texting me. He just came back into the meeting right now. He was having some difficulties with audio. Steve, are you able to speak now?
Steve, I was just inviting you to speak. I hope you heard some of my diatribe. It was a tribute to your feedback and advocacy that you've been giving me for a long time about diversifying income, diversifying operational streams, revenue streams. Can you hear us? Shoot. Bummer. Well, Steve will chime in when he can. Are there any, Ralph, can you share some of the thoughts you had about another board you sit on that you shared with me?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if there's great application here, but I do sit on another board that has a huge Head Start program. And I don't think it necessarily fits for us because the issue there, well, not with our existing facilities by any means. Although,
Except here.
yeah, maybe I don't know. I can't really speak to that. But when you have a facility, the question is how can you monetize? How can you make some money off of it?
We have evenings and weekends is what we're talking about.
Yeah. So one that I think is probably an obvious would be an after-school program, right? Because there's a huge need for parents to whether they can do with their kids after school. I mean that I think would be simple. The Head Start programs are pretty involved in terms of just they're federally funded, state and federally funded. You've got a whole process. It's complicated. There's only so much return that they allow you to take, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they're out there. I don't know who provides those services here in Santa Rosa or other places. Maybe something to explore.
And I don't know that this is a whole. I'm not saying this isn't more work, and I'll invite other comments. But what I think back to like where I live, and being a parent of young kids, I know where these holes are, and I know there are parents and nonprofits who want to have a facility to use like ours on weekends or evenings, or to be a partner with us. And so, I would think that our teachers or people in our communities where our sites are would also know. I'm not saying we're going to create a preschool or we're going to create a day. We don't have the resources to do that. But can we leverage some of our ability and then some of these after-school tutoring and other things with some of the one-time dollars we have? Are there other comments from board members? I know this is challenging, and you may just tell me no. But I think if we don't evolve, we're going to start to wither potentially.
This is Tom. I would say I agree with you. I think the daycare, preschool, we did those kind of things, but we created facilities for them. And they had playgrounds and they had their own buildings. And I don't think we've got that kind of a setup for that kind of a thing. But I think looking at other ways of using, very unusual facility, individual carrels and that kind of stuff, that somehow maybe tutoring would be an avenue, something like that, where it could be individualized to some degree. But I think we don't have facilities in a way for big events or, auditoriums and that kind of stuff that could be used to raise money. So I think it'd have to be much more selective in how it's handled. You got to be creative, and I think they're in these recent times create opportunities. So maybe something will pop up that says, yeah, we could do that. But I think we have to think more in the smallness and individual type situations, and maybe tutoring is one of those areas or something like that. I don't know, but yeah, facilities would be the big problem in a lot of these things. So, and we don't have them that are.
Yeah. In addition, having constructed a daycare preschool facility in my other life, I can tell you that the requirements for the programming are substantial. The licensing requirements, all of the things that you have to do are extremely time-consuming and challenging. So, and absent a facility, because there are specific requirements for the use of space for daycare and preschool, and square footage, and how many children you can have in so much space. I mean, it's really complicated.
I want to add on that one. They have more rules than the state has for schools. So it's very, very precarious.
Yeah.
Well, it's on top of our learning time. I see Kevin. I'll recognize you, and then Steve after Kevin. Go ahead.
My question was going to be to you, Jim. What is our driver to expand our service model for Rhodes Education Foundation? What is it that we do well, and how might we enhance that rather than necessarily look at expanding? So enhancement, perhaps through secondary tutoring, perhaps through, college to career placement opportunities, maybe a partnership program with CTE and the local community colleges might be something that's already aligned with what we do, that might enhance our programs and might actually be kind of income neutral or income generating.
Yes.
My advocacy is the same. I share Pat and Tom's concerns. I'll be very blunt. No after school program, no childcare program is going to earn you any income.
Okay.
They're basically going to be deficit based for at least the first 5 years. And when you offset the cost of facilities, staffing, and licensure. In Oak Grove, we had a private company that facilitated the after-school program and through childcare. When I was superintendent, I have an early childhood credential. The licensure process is an 18-month process just to go through licensure for an early childhood education center. And Pat's nodding because she's been through that, and it required my expertise. I had to hire an early childhood education coordinator, legal services. It's a very difficult and challenging process. And then, depending on what you charge for your services in relationship to which students are provided the service at no or reduced cost under federal and state funding, it's a very difficult program. After school programs or partnerships with the Boys and Girls Club, those kinds of things I did in Mount Diablo and in Newark. They're challenging, and we may be able to generate some income by renting facilities, if that's something that I hear you speaking to. Can we rent our facilities to other vendors? But again, as a independent charter school funded by or supported by our authorizers, again, I'm not certain, Jana, how does the whole facilities use process work with independent charters? So, for example, some agencies have the right to request a facilities use from a public entity at no cost.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, I don't know what are the facilities options of renting our spaces. So again, with what I've shared, I would just simply say, I don't think it's the time to initiate expenditure of new programs. Perhaps only look at what do we do and how can we do it better, or how can we enhance it through things like college to career placement, cooperation with our community colleges or regional opportunity programs, those kinds of things.
So to answer your question, good question. And I hear you on daycare. I'm learning preschool. I appreciate all that. So I take that as a given. To answer your question, what I was looking at is, one, to diversify our revenue stream, because I'm getting more anxious that we don't have another source of revenue. Then, so that's one of the first driver to me. Then to your question, what we do well, and knowing what we do well, where do we have underutilized resources or resources available that we could leverage that don't impact our core program, that create new revenues and serve a community need? I guess that's the question. That's what I'm asking. And Steve, can you hear us? Because you go ahead. You brought this up to me.
I can hear you, and I apologize for my technical difficulties today. I'm operating without electricity and on battery power. So, I mean, what Kevin just said, I have to echo. I mean, I wish I had a really great solution. I just don't. So I would just echo that that if we can rent out facilities, that probably doesn't add a ton of resources to the kitty, but that may be one area. And then anything having to do with the CTE, I know Jane and I have spoken about this, and there might be a glitch there with offering things that we offer to our students. We may not be able to offer to others. I don't understand those rules, but that may be a challenge as well. And I guess the third thing I would say is thinking a little bit about like a radical expansion of the programs and creating another school that may not quite look like the current 4 pivot resource centers that might provide a better cash flow of some sort. But that's a much bigger conversation.
So I was, I'm listening to this, and I guess one of the questions is, we want to diversify our revenues, but really, what is the risk we're worried about? And it's the 70% funding risk for online education, right? I mean, that's really what it is. And so, Jimmy asked the question: should we be looking at more in-person schools or something along those lines?
So I guess what I'm getting at today, this is a great discussion, and I didn't expect to solve it by any means. But what I do want us to do, we are going as a board to have a strategic planning and a thinking again, and really and I'm thinking that's in the fall as we start school. I'm hopeful that we're all vaccinated. The world's in a better spot to accommodate us in person to delve into these things. I guess what I'm asking or I'm advocating for today is, can Jana, she's willing to do this. We've talk to the attorney. I don't want to be a rogue board member because I know how that feels to be the city manager when I have one. So I'm trying to say, before I direct the staff to do something, I wanted to see what the board was interested in or not. And that's okay. That's why we're all stronger together having this dialogue. We may say, Jim, this is crazy right now. We can't do it. I'm good with that. Or what I hear is, one of the questions we have to answer is, what can we even do? And I didn't want to spend attorney dollars and some of Jana's time if the attorney says you can't do anything. Your facilities were paid for with state dollars. You can't do that. I don't think that's true because I see school districts and schools in my community leasing facilities to scouting groups and churches. And so I don't know. So that was all I was wanting to ask the board is, can Jana ask the questions of the attorney about what we can do? And when she's sitting with her staff having a strategic discussion, can she start to talk about what a different learning model might be? Is there some underutilization that could easily be or somewhat easily be legally utilized for some income? I guess pulling it back, that's what I wanted to see if there was any interest. And if there isn't, that's okay. But that's what I wanted to see if we could tell Jana to do today, so there'd be some homework done. When we come back to have more in-depth discussions, we'd have some information. Tom, I see your hand up, and then Liz.
I'll throw a wrench into all this, but my question to Jana would be, God help us all, about changing some of our charters to more, they're there and it's not independent study, and move them into that area where they become regular schools of sort, where the kids come to class and it is the charter itself and not independent as the way we are now, and transforming these charters from what they are to what they could become. That's a big issue, I'm sure, but it kind of relates back to what you're talking about. What's Kevin talking about? What do we do well, and then can we convert ourselves into something else and still do a great job? But that's a more consistent financial situation, I guess. Anyway, I pass that along because it sounds really easy.
Yeah, that is what I'm suggesting. Liz, and then Pat.
Yes, thanks. So I apologize. The version of the presentation I had up was a revised one I received this morning, but it didn't actually have some of my notes that I had added to this presentation. So I just swapped to the other one just because there were a few points I wanted to bring up as well. So you mentioned that, Jana talking to the attorneys, but I just want to point out that there are also implications with our accounting and back office services and insurance that we would potentially have to investigate for some of these things. And our landlords for what our leases allow us to do. So depending on which avenues we may want to look into, ed tech may not be able to assist with accounting and bookkeeping of those things. So we might need a whole kind of administrative structural, staffing change in terms of who's going to do the bookkeeping and manage those revenues. Ed tech is exclusively for public school based finances essentially. And so there are certain types of activities that they do not manage or handle. And similar to that, our insurance, we have very specific things, at least currently through CharterSafe, that are specific to charter school activities by nonprofit corporations, but they don't cover all nonprofit corporate type activities. So we will also have to investigate what things are permissible under our current, vendors, and look into avenues for what we might need to change if we were to add some of those things.
Thanks for the encouraging comments. Pat, you have your hand up.
So I have a question based on the comments that Tom made about, transitioning our current online model to maybe a classroom-based model on some basis. By doing that, does that change the potential for students who are currently enrolled in our online program to want to continue with Pivot?
It's a good question. First, to address Tom's comment, it would be a material revision to our charter to say that we have, in addition, and this answers your question, Pat, in addition to our virtual and online program, we can offer a site-based program. A school doesn't have to be all one thing or another. We actually could have a site-based program and have independent study. A lot of districts do, right? Under one school. So we can do both. The biggest limitation with anything going to we are meeting our 80% of our instructional minute requirements in front of a credentialed teacher is the facilities limitation. How do we get 80%, how do we get all of our kids to have 80% of their time at our facility? Mm-hmm. So that is one of the biggest constraints of offering anything in the current facilities that we have. If we wanted to protect some of our population, protect our longevity, and also offer a site-based program, the limitation is facilities. But yes, we could still offer blended. We could still offer independent study for the kids who want that. And again, the statistics, our data shows us that only 40 to 50, and here at North Bay, at sometimes it was 60% of our kids actually use the resource center. So we still would, protect, 40 to 50% of our kids and never come in at all. They could be under one program, and we could offer a site-based program to protect us long term. But it is a material revision to the current charters that I think we could with our current authorizers, we could, get that through. Chico Unified, I don't know whether they would want another site-based program there, but I think the other authorizers would support that. So it's, it is doable. It's a whole different ball of wax though. We would literally probably move towards something like, you're an independent study teacher, you're a site-based teacher. You don't want too much of that overlap. It becomes confusing for the staff.
Okay, Kevin has his hand raised, and OJ, I also see your hand raised, so you'll come in after Kevin.
All right.
My comment was just very simple in that we made no revenue from leasing facilities in the districts which I worked. There's multiple tiers of facilities use for public facilities. We actually often took a loss because we would have to have our own custodial or some type of site personnel there to open and close the facility, which the vendor was not required to pay for. So, and nonprofit organizations like Scouts, churches, etc., used our facilities at no cost under the facilities use permit process for publicly funded facilities. So it was not income generating. We actually operated most often at a loss because we had to provide personnel to be there to open and close the facility under their contract. So again, I don't think that that's necessarily an option for us.
Okay, thank you. OJ?
Well, my thought was just the opposite of Kevin's, in the sense that most communities have very little business meeting space, and there's people like me who is known to be a meeting planner or facility user that was always looking for a place to have a board meeting, a place to have a half-day meeting on Saturday or Sunday, and had a difficult time finding it. The items that Kevin brought up are an issue, but you just have to work that business model so that it works in your favor.
I could comment a little bit.
Go ahead.
Just
So-
real quick, Pat. Well, I'm not 100% sure, and this is where I think Jim is asking, do you want me to find out? While we pay for our pivot program with public dollars at this facility, I don't know, and it's a question mark, that this is considered the same kind of public facility as a traditional school district. It's not DSA. It's not built with public dollars. It is actually a privately owned facility that we just happen to rent. So we might have some wiggle room there around some of the things that Kevin said, but I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there.
Tom, I see your hand, Pat, but is your hand still raised, or did you have another comment, or is that from last time? Okay, Pat, go ahead. Tom. Okay, Tom is unraised. Thank you.
Right.
Oh,
Re-raised.
you're muted.
So I think that the issues that Kevin and Jana raise are significant, because even if based on the fact that these are privately held facilities, they were not built with public dollars and all of that, it seems to me that in order to make a program like this work, we still have to have full cost recovery. And if that includes the cost of staff who are engaged in it, maintenance of the facilities, all that kind of thing, then you have to build in the costs for all of that so that you get full cost recovery, including, an overhead cost that you generate that makes it worth doing this. And then what happens, OJ, is it then becomes somewhat cost prohibitive when you look at what you actually have to charge in order to cover all your costs. And a lot of organizations that want to use space, they begin to balk because they think it should either be free or it should be really cheap because it's a school facility. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that full cost recovery in order to make this venture worthwhile can make the cost of doing business for potential users cost prohibitive.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Steve, I see you raised your hand. Go ahead.
I sure did. And this is fascinating. I don't really understand all of the implications, but one of the things that we might do is whatever that prop was it 86 or 68 that had the like $1 million of one-time use funds. If we can upgrade some of our facilities to have state-of-the-art equipment for the students, of course, but then that equipment could also be used for these outside groups. And to piggyback on OJ's comments about more for-profits, then perhaps that would be more attractive to them. And absolutely, Pat is right. It's not just about recovering costs. It's about making some sort of margin on it. So and including all of the costs that we know, including human resources and cleaning and what have you. I mean,
that's right. I'm sorry, go ahead.
In my limited view of it, it's a possibility, and the question is, how much of a possibility is it? Is it going to be worth our while to?
That is what I'm asking
this?
for, to allow the staff to explore. And that we have these one-time dollars where there are things that we could do with the resources people we have, additional stipends and hours to see if anything would work. But I don't think it sounds like I think we've been better at saying what we can't do than what we can. That's how I feel. And so I'll leave it at that. And I did my job as chairman, asking a question. I think we need to diversify our resources. It sounds like we're not there yet. So we'll see where we are in the fall. And I hope things don't wither on us. Ralph.
So, you know, we've kind of been all over the place, but I want to revisit the concept of the in-person, you know, sort of making some amendments to our charters, because we're going to go through rechartering with our different authorizers, and we've got this effort out there to really ding us. And as I look at that effort that's out there, and I look at the fact that we're already going through a recharter process, why aren't we trying to add some flexibility? Like, would it be absolutely silly for us not to? That's not necessarily the additional revenues that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
But I think you raised it, Tim,
Protection.
and I think it's something that we should really consider, because if there is a change in the law, we're going to have to make a change.
Period.
Period.
And I don't like being reactionary. I like being ahead of things, so we're not flat-footed.
So I would just say, like, I do want to investigate this, and I'm going to support that. But away from that, I think we really should be thinking about making that decision quickly, because we are going through a reauthorization, and because there is this threat out there. And if this threat does come through, we're going to have to change.
Okay, so coming out of this, I think, let me try and summarize this. If there's any more board member comments, I can't tell if hands are raised or just remaining to be raised from previous comments. So I think we approved the budget assumptions that the budget committee had, and I think you got direction on that. I think we're not supportive yet of any creative other sources, but we are interested in understanding from you what a different charter might look like, the implications on our existing operation, and is that something that is worth pursuing? Maybe we could talk about that at our next meeting. Sound good? Does that sound good, board members? Okay, I think I see some thumbs up. Okay, well, great. Then I will, assuming that's where we are and we have support for that, I will close our budget workshop. There's no action, so there's no other comment necessary. And with that, then we would adjourn into a closed session, which I think we have a different link for the board. Good afternoon. The board has come out of closed session, and there is no reportable action. And so item 7.1 is upcoming regular meetings. The next meeting of the board will be April 3rd at 8:30 a.m., followed by June 5th at 8:30 a.m., and those will continue to be virtual meetings. And so those will be our next two meeting dates. And other than that, there being no business, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.